Well, good evening, and thank you so much, the organizers, for inviting me to be with these esteemed co-panelists and to, in the presence of Elekalim, it's hard to follow that, but I'll try. I've come up from San Francisco, so a lot of my well, let's put it this way, my main enemy is the United States. So, but I often in my mind, because I've learned from Canadian Indigenous people and immigrants and all the experiences they have, and people in other parts of the world that deal with Canadian multinationals, that it's not much different except for one crucial thing, and that is that we in the United States consume 40% of the world's resources, and we're only 5% of the world's population. That's a pretty big difference in scale of harm done, and that's only the beginning. We won't talk about the military hardware, which is being pulled out at this moment. So I have never understood, since I came to consciousness as what we now call feminists. I didn't really know that word at the time, but angry about misogyny. I grew up poor and rural and part Indian in a forgotten part of the country, Oklahoma, and very backward, truly very backward ideologically, still is. And a Baptist and all. So when I went out into the world, first Oklahoma City, then to Norman, University of Oklahoma, where I made it only for a year, then I got married, and then moving to California, to San Francisco, I thought I had a very strong class identification because my grandfather had been a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, and my grandfather named my father Moyer, Haywood, Pettibones, Scarberry, Dunbar. Those are the names of the founders, co-founders of the IWW, who were on trial the very time my father was born in August 1907 for murder in Boise. So I grew up with a consciousness from my father of class. Basically, he was not very sophisticated. He didn't finish high school even, nor did my mother, but it was pretty much hate the rich, and it took me a while to identify who they really were. It wasn't just having money, limousine, or a big car or something, which I thought, or let's say a flush toilet. But to really understand the system of wealth and capitalism. But I thought class, I had a very strong class identity, and I thought that's why I was discriminated against, which I was. My accent, my weird vocabulary or lack of vocabulary. I had to struggle really, really hard to keep up in college, and I went back. I went to San Francisco State. I went to a junior college. Then I got some encouragement. It's amazing, if someone says you're smart, you start being smarter than you knew you could be. And I found I had a real knack with history because I had a very strong basis in oral tradition and memory. Not just memorization, but memory of stories, and falling in love with stories. I had a wonderful history professor who encouraged me to do history, and then got me a scholarship to go to graduate school at UC Berkeley. And boy, was I ever out of my element there, let me tell you. I transferred to UCLA because I decided I wanted to do Latin American history, and they had area studies at UCLA. So suddenly I'm in a situation in a history department, the most male-dominated to this day field there is, I believe, I'm not sure, where there were only 3 women out of 400 graduate students. And I started being discriminated. I'm equal. I'm thought to be very special because they brought me from Berkeley. They got me from Berkeley, the #1 university in the country. And they had, I was treated like I was smart. But I started being treated in another way, like other graduate students asking me to type their papers. The ones that weren't married, who had women to type their papers. So I started noticing these things, and I said, this is something different. And I got really angry, and angry that I hadn't noticed it before, that a lot of things had happened. Violence, sexual violence, everything I took as class. So it made me rethink class. Other things made me rethink a strictly class analysis or an economic class analysis when I became aware and learned about imperialism. That's why I wanted to study Latin American history, because it was clear that was the way to understand U.S. imperialism, the longest lasting backdoor imperialism. So for me it was organic, this melding of feminism, really angry woman feminism, I tell you, really talking back a lot, loudmouth feminism, alienating almost everyone, burning bridges, along with anti-imperialism, and still strictly holding on to my basic class analysis. But I didn't find it so easy when I became a co-founder among, maybe 40 or 50 other women of what we call the women's liberation movement. And they really came out of the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, young women, those of us involved in Students for a Democratic Society, or some were involved in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who began to see that their talents were not being used. They were being, they were doing all the work, all the physical work, but none of the mental work, or being, spokespersons, or being put out in front as leadership. So tonight, our theme tonight here, and I think is such an important one, is women in the leadership of anti-imperialist movements. I think this time has come. We've seen this leadership, been inspired by it, for me, ever since the Algerian war, then the Cuban Revolution, and then the Vietnamese and the African liberation movements, and Latin American. And then particularly as I came to realize that right under my nose and in my own cultural background, there was this very strong woman-based, it's called matriarchal, but it's not really that, it's really equality. It's really inclusion and equality. When women are strong and equal, suddenly it's called matriarchy, like they're running everything. But in fact, that is not the way. Collaboration and cooperation is something women have survival skills that require those, for their survival and the survival of their children. So it's an element that is not necessarily in every woman, not even in every mother, of course, and not in every Indigenous society now. But the strength of the cultures that have been renewed over and over through resistance, and let's say to Canada and the United States, to Britain and Spain, have brought some of those strands of social relations and how people can live in the world and build societies that the goal of which is happiness and in tune with, you know, with the surroundings, with all of life. So all of those things put together, we now have access to. We feel very depressed about the situation in the world, but the fact is that we weren't able to stop all these things. And if we look at what was left out, generations and generations, 500 years of struggle where really women have not been allowed to be fully functional in those struggles, or once they're won. Back in the 60s, we looked a lot at the Algerian national liberation movement and those amazing women, and then how they didn't show up in public. You know, when I started doing work at the UN, I'm thinking, how come, you know, these newly liberated countries, how come there are no women here? And of course the men always say, well, they're doing the important work back home. And that's true, but men can do that important work too, you know, like raising children and cooking and washing and all. They're not incapable of that. So what we have to learn from these anti-imperialist revolutionary struggles for to build a really strong mass women's movement here in the United States especially, is learn from those past struggles, learn from Layla, learn from the Sandinista women, the Cuban women, the Vietnamese women, but also learn the limitations. And that limitation is, you know, has to do with the state formation once the state is formed, the capitalist state, and where capitalism controls the world through imperialism, there's a replication. So that is not going to be changed. The African liberation movements, which we had so much inspiration from, the African socialism. We now have Indigenous socialism, Evo Morales. But Evo's having to do a lot of things, you know, for the people of Bolivia to survive. Mining contracts, poisoning water, and all that. You can't really get out of. So this I think we have to take all those things together, and it's not, as I once thought, you know, this sort of a clearer cut. But I think it's exciting because we've learned that. We have so much understanding and knowledge now from all the mistakes of the past and all of the inspirations of the past, how we can live in the world as revolutionaries and make that a magnet for everyone to want to be a part of that by the way we live and exemplify. I would mention, because I know it's one of the points that the organizers talked about a lot, and how much how we handle it, especially Canada and the United States, but I'm sure it also happens in France and Britain. Of course, British Empire is very famous for rescuing the women, rescuing Arab women. That our desires for liberation as women, to be fully functioning revolutionaries, are used as an imperialist ploy to invade other countries. And it often works for women who say, well, what will happen in Afghanistan? What will happen to the women? Well, what's happening to the women, you know, for the last 10 years, 11, 12 years of being in Afghanistan? So we have to really be outspoken. We have to build a voice that's really heard, a mass voice, to overcome that exploitation. And I'm sure, I know Israel uses that as well. And it really creates a deep divide that we have to try to constantly explain that it's not us. Well, I will finish by pointing out this other aspect of the status of women in the world. Martha gave some really important figures, nationally, and they're almost exactly like the United States. But I looked this up, and I was actually kind of shocked. I didn't know it was this extreme, that 40% of the world's formal workforce, now this doesn't mean housewives who are, women who are working at home, or in the informal, black market, selling things on the street, or probably not even sex workers, most sex workers. So 40% of the world's formal workforce is now held by women. And women only hold 1% of the world's GDP. That is a kind of wealth. So that's almost like, slavery, form of slavery, of having no or very little compensation on the whole. So this is capitalism and imperialism very, very clearly, that this is something so structural and so deep that all the UN programs in the world, many of which are amazing, that they have done to promote women, but some are so stupid, like micro-lending. I mean, stupid and dangerous and harmful. So I think we have to come up, those of us who understand these things, we have to come up with plans and programs, and it is possible to, get these ideas spread into the UN system, how they do that work, into the school system, into at least some of the non-governmental organizations that function. They want to do things right, but these ideas are things that we have, and we should not keep them to ourselves, but spread them widely. So I love what these organizations in Canada, you all are so far ahead of us. I was here in December at the No One is Illegal 10th anniversary, and we don't have an immigration mass movement anywhere near what you have. So I come here to get inspired, and also by the strong revolutionary women in Canada. Thank you.